Okay, sorry about that, everyone. We had started the podcast at the regular time, but I had technical difficulties, so we're going to do the short version. This is the 15th episode of Dreaming in Symbols, and my guest today is Klingshcor, and the topic is Hagarism, the book by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook. We're going to talk about Islam, and I apologize, Klingshcor, for the technical difficulties. My computer decided to just crash and then decided to do some updates. So
It's my fault because I said hopefully we won't have any snafus. I attempted to say we had a snafu. I apologize.
No problem.
But it won't crash this time.
Right.
I'll jinx it again,
That's right. Well, go ahead and like I said, I just did a quick little intro and explain what happened. So please go ahead and take it away, and hopefully, knock on wood, we won't have any problems.
All right, great. But also, a friend of mine said, "Tell the podcast that I said hello, cute hamster face, please." So there's my gratuitous shout out, Platine. All right.
Awesome.
Now, hey, all right. Right. So, yes, we're talking about Michael Cook and Patricia Crone's 1977 work, Hagarism or Hagerism. I'm not sure what the correct pronunciation is. Let's just go with Hagarism provisionally, but I might accidentally say Hagerism instead, so forgive me. Hagarism. It was quite a controversial book. It caused a bit of outrage. It still does, and it's interesting to see how different groups, different parties have treated the text or the narratives that they've created around this text. So, for example, I have here a paraphrase and a quote from, for example, Daniel Pipes, who's an anti-Islam activist. Or an Islamophobe, if you will, or an anti-Muslim bigot, whatever. And he says that Crone and Cook are, quote, in the role of termites, unquote, eating away at Islam. But despite this, Muslims are, quote, acting as though the beams and joints were as strong as ever, unquote. So for some people, Hagarism became a tool with which to sort of, facilitate their anti-Islam activism by showing that Islam was, the religion originated in a far different form and has, wildly mutated or whatever, and the tradition is unreliable and the early sources debunk the latest, or whatever. This sort of Hagarism became a means to facilitate certain political activism, if you will, on one end. And on the other end, we have fairly hysterical Muslim apologist and ideological response to Hagarism as well. And we have some pretty interesting rhetoric in that end. So, for example, one author, a notable example of this sort of vitriol is someone called, I can't pronounce this, I'm sorry, but is it Liaquat Ali Khan, or is it just Ali Khan? And I don't know. Someone called Khan. He says that the book's title is quasi-pejorative and possibly racist. It's just another book in the large dump of attack literature. He says that it has juvenile findings, and it's a scandalous thesis which maligns the faith of more than 1 billion people. We've got some there's some pretty angry rhetoric here, and more recently, for example, someone on Twitter claimed that Patricia Crone is a fringe, rubbished bigot. No one takes her theories seriously except phobes, unquote. So this sort of gives you an idea of sort of some of the different narratives that have been constructed around Hagarism since it was published in 1977. some of the different reactions. For me personally, I think I discovered Hagerism back in 2009, 2010, maybe earlier. And when I first encountered it, it seemed quite mysterious and marvelous. I mean, the cover purports to explain, quote, the making of the Islamic world, unquote, like a revisionist expose into the origins of Islam, which is quite fascinating. But on the other hand, it's quite an impenetrable text. The highly technical vocabulary of the authors is sometimes difficult to understand, and so it's actually taken me, I guess this is maybe my third reading now of Hagerism, in order to begin to properly understand it. And what I'm working on at the moment is an article on the legacy of Hagerism, in which I explain the methodology, the arguments, the reception, and the impact of Hagerism since its publication. And it's quite interesting, the fact that, I mean, I would say there's quite a similarity between Krohn and Motzki, in that for even though people often have such strong views about these academics, I suspect that most of the time a lot of the people with these strong views haven't read these works, right? It seems like most of the people who, for example, claim that Motzki, whatever, supports the Sunnah or the reliability of the Hadith, haven't read Motzki, for example, right? Or the people who claim that Hagerism is whatever, like a racist, insane diatribe or something, haven't read Hagerism, right? So it's sort of and even, for example, to give an example from myself, I used to think that Hagerism argued that Muhammad didn't exist, that he was mythical. Now, it actually doesn't argue that. Patricia Crone and Michael Cook in Hagerism argued that Muhammad did exist, and they explain what his role might have been, right? So how on earth did I think that he didn't exist according to Hagerism? Well, it was because that's something that some people have said about the book, right? It's the narratives themselves sort of obscure the actual content, and the actual content is obscured also by the highly technical vocabulary in which it's articulated. So, in fact, I can't resist to draw this analogy. Maybe it's sort of like the Quran itself, where we have a book that's highly, it's often quite difficult to penetrate and understand what it actually means. Although in the case of Crone and Cook, it's the highly technical vocabulary. In the case of the Quran, it's the complete lack of context that we have for the text, and also the sort of the vague and elliptical style that's often employed in the text. And so for both of these books, Hagerism and the Quran, instead, most people's understandings are strained through, an exegetical framework, later opinions and theories, and so on and so forth, which I find quite, I don't know, quite funny, I suppose. But before I go on explaining, Hagerism's methodology, and arguments, and reception and impact, I'll just check in with Ozzy. What are your thoughts thus far, Ozzy?
Well, I think it's great that
I don't want to just monologue,
Right.
Give me some feedback.
No problem. Well, I think it's great that you started off by talking about giving us a little taste of the different views, or at least the different ways that people view Hagerism, and how maybe it's been utilized, whether it's polemical or apologetic, or as someone on Twitter saying that Patricia Crone is just a fringe historian. And I suppose then the major thing to point out is that from your point of view, most of the people who have a very strong feeling, or I should say a negative feeling about Hagerism, are individuals that have not read the book themselves, and they're getting their information elsewhere. And I think that's just a really important thing to note in general, because I feel like that was the argument that was used against Tom Holland and his documentary and his book, where he
That's
had
true.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I think it's worthy to point out that when it comes to studying religion, if you feel like you're going to disagree with the book, you should probably read the book first before coming to the conclusion that you disagree with it. But I just wanted to highlight that point. But please go ahead and continue.
Yeah, in fact, this occurs a lot actually. I guess this is just to do with the more broadly, perhaps, with the phenomenon of straw men and of certain texts being designated to have play a certain role by ideologies, either a positive or negative role, and being treated accordingly, regardless of the actual content. So, for example, Finkelstein's work jumps to mind, where he's often accused of being, well, he used to be anyway, of being like a Holocaust denialist and all this insane shit like that, when his family actually, went through the Holocaust, were in Majdanek concentration camp and Auschwitz and so on and so forth, right? But people didn't read his work. They just, it was because it undermined certain conservative ideologies and claims. It was just sort of given this gloss by certain parties and this sort of interpretation without anyone ever actually reading the books, for example. I mean, that's just one example that jumps to mind, because I've become quite familiar with Finkelstein's work, but I'm sure there are many others. So I guess this even goes beyond these sort of texts or religion or whatever. This seems to be a broader problem, a problem more broadly with people criticizing materials that they haven't actually read, driven by some sort of ideological impetus, rather than any sort of actual, identifying actual errors or whatever. So anyway, that's a general note on style or something, I suppose. So let's get to the main material here. So Hagerism's methodology. Let's begin with the methodology. So this is actually, I think, the most important part about Hagerism, is that Krohn and Cook outlined, they implemented, they pioneered basically like a new methodology within the field of Islamic studies. Obviously, this sort of approach has been implemented elsewhere. It's kind of a travesty that it hadn't been implemented before, or to any significant or systematic degree within the field, but it's just a result of the historical exigencies of Orientalism. Anyway, so as Krohn and Cook say in their introduction, quote, "In making the attempt, we have adopted an approach which differs appreciably from that of more conventional writing in the field," unquote. And so basically what they did was they prioritized earlier sources over later sources. Right. I mean, it sounds when you put it like that, it's just sort of like, yeah, no shit, like, of course, why wouldn't you do that? But I mean, for the longest time, that was how Islamic studies operated, in the reverse. Older sources from centuries later. I mean, I'm actually astonished when I read some of the works. People will take dictionaries from like the 1200s or something, and then treat them as if, like, uncritically, positivistically, as if, yes, this can tell us about, the early 7th century. It just seems ludicrous. And so what Krohn and Cook did was to actually move past the later classical sources and to say, what do the earliest sources, the contemporaneous sources, etc., what do they tell us? So this sort of prioritizing earlier over, in effect, earlier non-Muslim sources over later Muslim sources. And so this was the sort of the methodology they pioneered. Additionally, they also utilized some contemporaneous Paleo-Muslim archaeological materials as well. But the key methodology here is prioritizing earlier sources over later sources. And they also went on an aside to explain why the Islamic tradition, if you will, the traditional Muslim historiography is um, extremely problematic for the early development of Islam, i.e., it's late and it's unverifiable. There's also a bunch of other problems that Crone subsequently articulated in another book, but we won't go into that. Although Crone also, in that other book I just mentioned, she also demonstrates that there is methodology that we can employ on the later Muslim historiography to extract earlier data, this sort of like a chronological and prosopographical methodology. And more recently, Motsky's also developed a methodology that allows us to sort of date some hadith, but you know, we'll get onto this later. But for now, the key point is that largely the later traditional Muslim historiography from the 800s onwards and the 900s and so on is quite late and quite unverifiable. So as Cook famously said, quote, "The only way out of the dilemma is thus to step outside the Islamic tradition altogether and start again," unquote. And with that famous quote, they set off into revisionism and into a radical new theory of Islamic origins. So that's the first important thing about Hagerism, is that the novel, in their field at least, the novel methodology that they pioneered, earlier sources over later sources. The second important thing that they did in Hagerism was that they recognized that Islam and the Arab Empire emerged within a broad historical or cultural context. It didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't come out of a vacuum. It emerged in the cultural context of late antiquity. And this is a pretty important context to consider. And since Hagerism, this has now become solidly mainstream, this idea of orienting and understanding Islam and the Arab Empire within the cultural context in which it emerged, late antiquity, late antique religious trends, and so on and so forth. So that's the second point. And I'll give you a quote from Cronin Cook where they mention this quote: "Secondly, we have expended a good deal of energy, both scholastic and intellectual, on taking seriously the obvious fact that the formation of Islamic civilization took place in the world of late antiquity, and what is more, in a rather distinctive part of it," unquote. And the final thing that Cronin Cook set out to do in their in Hagerism is to sort of articulate or sketch and like an overarching conceptual framework and periodization for the emergence of Islam, for the emergence of the early Arab Empire. Quote, "Finally, we have set out with a certain recklessness to create a coherent architectonic of ideas in a field over much of which scholarship has yet to dig the foundations," unquote. So these are sort of the three key sort of methodological or conceptual innovations and points you should consider within Hagerism broadly. This is sort of the methodology in a nutshell. Prioritizing early sources over later sources, acknowledging the late antique cultural context, and sort of trying to sketch out some sort of framework or periodization. So the key point to take away from this is that Hagerism was an experimental exercise, the implementation of an unprecedented methodology. The conclusions were like tentative and provisional. They were not supposed to be definitive. So as the authors explicitly said in the preface, and I quote, "It follows, of course, that new discoveries of early materials could dramatically confirm, modify, or refute the positions we have taken up," unquote. And years later, Crone allegedly said, quote, "The book was just a hypothesis, not a conclusive finding," unquote. So this is the important thing to consider, is that what we have with Hagerism is an experimental exercise in a new methodology. So what were the conclusions? What did Crone and Cook discover. Oh, but before I continue, though, do you have any thoughts, Ozzy?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to point out that Crone said that later findings could modify their theory, and that it is a theory or a method, as you said, sort of an exercise in this new type of research. I'm wondering if you have found, because I feel like I've heard polemicists or even apologists, sort of take those quotes out of context to sort of say like, oh, look, Crone sort of later on in life dismissed the entire book or the merits of the book or the methodology of the book. I don't know if you're aware of such out of context quotations, but I'm wondering if the quotes you just mentioned might be the ones that are usually cherry picked.
Oh no, yes, absolutely. This is I actually took that quote from Crone. The one about our conclusions will change accordingly. That's from the preface of Hagerism itself. The quote about for Crone saying that it was a hypothesis or whatever. I've taken that from an article written by Khan, who I mentioned before, the angry Muslim ideologue who snarlingly condemned Hagerism. And he says in his article, on April 3rd, 2006, I had a phone conversation with Michael Cook, and we talked about Hagerism. He said to me the following, which he later confirmed by means of an email. Quote, the central thesis of that book was, I now think, mistaken. Over the years, I have gradually come to think the evidence we had to support the thesis was not sufficiently or internally consistent enough, unquote. On April 6th, 2006, I interviewed Patricia Crone, as well to see what she now thinks about the book. She was even more candid in repudiating the central thesis of the book. She agrees with the critics that the book was a graduate essay. The book was published in 1977 when the authors lived in England. Quote, we were young and we did not know anything. The book was just a hypothesis, not a conclusive finding. I do not think that the book's thesis is valid, unquote. So these are the quotes about Crone and Cook repudiating their own work. But the thing to take away here is that what's being repudiated is basically the central thesis.
The central thesis being.
Well, we'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
Jumping
ahead here.
and I would agree. Actually, I think the central thesis is wrong. But that doesn't. So I think that Hagerism is outdated, but it's certainly not redundant. And that's what people are trying to portray here: is that when the authors are basically saying that the work is outdated, people are trying to make it seem as though they're saying that the book is redundant and that, and in general, that the book is now redundant, which is not correct. What's not being repudiated here is the methodology. And even a lot of the conclusions, I think, were either correct or partially correct. So there's still a lot of valuable material in the book, and I would still highly recommend it to anyone who wanted to learn about the origins of Islam. I think it's a really good starting point. And then you go and you read Hoyland and Donner and Shoemaker for the more recent, updated perspectives. But there's a lot of, but look, we'll get to that in a moment, right? There's what parts of Hagerism have been sort of validated over more recently, and so on and so forth. So we'll get there. So the point is that those quotes are exploited to try and make it seem like Hagerism is redundant, when in actual fact it's merely outdated. Does that distinction make sense?
Yes, it's perfect. So go ahead and I think that clears it up, and so
yep.
We can look at the central thesis.
Arguments.
Sure.
Yes. So there's two ways I could do this. I can either give you a super concise summary or a concise summary. Which would be preferable?
Well, that's a good question. Are you?
Concise summary gives more detail. The super concise summary gives much less detail, but it's shorter. So do you want a bit more detail, or do you want to be quicker?
Why don't we start with the super concise, just for the sake
Okay, all right.
for the sake of time, and if I have any clarifying questions, I'll just jump in and,
yep.
and we can expand on some stuff.
Yep. Okay, so so what I've done is I've read through the first few chapters of Hagerism and I've summarized it, and then for this show I went and summarized the summary. So it's, hopefully we've distilled it down to the key points. So this is sort of, I'm gonna give their arguments or their conclusions in sort of a chronological form. Right, and the chronology is kind of approximate because sometimes it isn't clear when things are supposed to have happened. But basically, this is what Crone and Cook infer from the earliest sources. So from the 620s to the 630s, on the basis of their common Abrahamic heritage and inheritance, the eschatological herald Muhammad leads the messianic Judeo-Arab or Judeo-Hagarine invasion of Palestine. This event is the Exodus, the Hijra, and his followers are thus both Hagarines and emigrants, Muhajirun. From the 630s to the 640s, Muhammad is succeeded by the Judeo-Hagarine Messiah Umar, El-Faruq, the Redeemer. But at some point, subsequent to the conquest of Jerusalem, the Hagarines start to disassociate from their Jewish allies for certain ideological reasons. Due to certain ideological necessities to do with them conquering and having a vast empire and whatever. 640s to the 660s, Judeo-Hagerism becomes just Hagerism. They've disassociated themselves from Judaism, from the Jewish alliance, and the messianic status of Ammar is revoked. And Ammar just becomes a leader and not the Messiah anymore. 660s to in terms of the Hagarine conception, 660s to 680s, Muawiyah rules the Hagarine polity, which is becoming Christian influenced and adopts a modified Christology. This is to help distinguish it from Judaism, and an effective way to do that is to adopt Jesus as part of your theology. 680s to 690s, in order to create a distinct identity, the Hagarines cast their religion as a revival of pure Abrahamic monotheism. So this also allows them to distinguish themselves from the Christians. So they're not Jews and they're not Christians. They're actually unique. They are, revival of the pure Abrahamic religion, Milat Ibrahim Hanif, and then from the 690s to the 700s, the rudimentary Hagarine Abrahamism, which is quite, it's not very sophisticated, so it doesn't quite meet the ideological needs of the Arabs, who are now an imperial elite, subject to polemical attention and requiring a more coherent ideological theory to justify themselves, sort of. So the rudimentary Hagarine Abrahamism is supplemented by Samaritan concepts of scripture, and so consequently the Quran is composed by Al-Hajjaj bin Yusuf to articulate and rationalize Hagarine theology. Muhammad is recast as a revivalist prophet, and a new sacred geography is established in Hijaz. And Samaritanism also provides the Hagarines with a new conceptual terminology and identity, Islam and Muslim. And so Islam replaces Hijra as the central concept of the central act of the religion, and thus Muslim replaces Muhajir as sort of the identifying title of the members. After that, the empire shifts from Syria to Iraq as the Umayyads are destroyed and the Abbasids take over, and this places sort of the center of the early Islamic culture within a rabbinical Jewish context in Iraq, which is sort of the center of rabbinical Judaism, I think, at the time. This is where the Babylonian Talmud is created and so on. And so under the influence of this Jewish rabbinical, legal, scholarly, clerical culture, the ulama emerge, the hadith emerge, and Islamic law emerges, and Islam acquires its, more classical structures. Everything gets grafted into hadith, and thus Islam sort of has emerged by by 800 or something. And that's sort of, in a nutshell, that's the thesis of Hagerism.
Well, I could see why that would piss off traditional Orthodox individuals, because that completely contradicts the
yes,
established narrative.
For sure. Now, you want do you want me to explain this in more detail, where I just summarized, or should I move on to receptions and impact? Because I don't mind. If you'd like more detail, we can go into a little bit more detail on this.
Why don't you say a little more about the exact influence that rabbinical Judaism had on the Abbasids during the power transition?
Sure. So let's see. So following the collapse of the Umayyads in the 740s, new caliphate centered in Baghdad. This is when a learned laity, the ulama and the fuqaha, they emerge, and they set about creating like the holy law, the sharia and the fiqh. And I quote Cook and Crone, there can in fact be little doubt that Islam acquired its classical rabbinic form in the shadow of Babylonian Judaism, probably in the aftermath of the transfer of power from Syria to Iraq in the middle of the 8th century. And so under the influence of this rabbinical culture, the early Muslim jurists begin to create Islamic law, and consequently a hadith. So just as sort of the rabbinical law is justified as an oral tradition originating from the halakha of Moses on Sinai or whatever, in the same way, the Islamic law becomes justified as an oral tradition originating with the Sunnah of Muhammad. So it's essentially the same model. However, the early Muslim clergy are racked by scripturalist and rationalist debates over the source of law and theology, like the Mu'tazilites, who sort of emphasize reason, the Ashab al-Hadith, who emphasize scripturalism and how everything has to be sort of based on authority of early authorities. The Hanafis emphasized qiyas and ra'i, and so on and so forth. You have a pretty vicious fighting. I mean, even amongst the so-called imams of Sunni Islam. So there's a famous quote from I think Imam Shafi'i, who says that the Abu Hanifa and Malik, or the Hanafis and the Malikis, are the Ahl Arai, the people of opinion. He said it contemptuously, and so on and so forth. And so from this, as a result of this conflict, there was a massive fabrication of isnads, of hadith, by the Muslim rabbis, so to speak, the muhaddithun, to bolster sunnah-based law. And so, and by doing this, these Muslim rabbis, to use Crone and Cook's terminology, they were able to, quote, defend the oral tradition item by item, tracing back each individual element to the Prophet with some suitable chain of authorities, isnad, unquote. And so this was like, in terms of its magnitude and detail, I mean, this was pretty unprecedented, I think. And it transcended its origins as an imitation of the rabbinical oral tradition. And so in doing this, quote, the Hagerenes had achieved a new, independent and effective solution to a central dilemma of learned monotheism. And with this, their undignified clientage to the peoples they had conquered was finally at an end, unquote. So the solution to to these challenges about authority and validity of customs and so on and so forth, debates about what the source of law should be, impelled essentially the muhaddithun to substantiate all of their customs, all of their positions with hadith, with isnads. And thus this sort of more classical system emerged. This ilm al hadith and ilm al rijal and sunnah based law, hadith sahih, all that whole system emerged through this process, according to Cronin Cook.
So essentially, you have these scholars who are forging, if you will, or creating an entire system that would, I assume, their hopes would be to be, airtight in terms of theological conundrums, or being able to.
And it was right at the time. I mean, they won. I mean, Sunnis now are the majority because it was convincing, right, to people at the time. They would say, look, everything, all of our sunnah, all of our customs, all of our law comes straight from the founding figure of our religion, from his sunnah, and we can trace it back person by person to his time, to his praxis. I mean, that was a powerful argument at the time, surely. I mean, it must have been, because look, now Sunnis are the majority, right? So they won out over many others, although in fairness, there was also state support for this as well, like El Mutawakkil and so on and so forth. But I think it flourished regardless of that as well, because it was just I think probably a more convincing model for people, for the scholars. So thus classical Islam emerged.
Great. All right. Well, I guess let's. Would you like to jump into the reception of the book?
Yeah. All right. We can come back to specific details subsequently. Yeah. So the reception. My goodness. So there were several kinds of responses to Hagerism, with varying degrees of temper and professionalism. Some of them were a bit upset. I'll give you some quotes. It's this one's quite special. Hagerism, foaled in the same stable, though lacking the depth of Dr. Wansbrough's undisputed learning, is not only bitterly anti-Islamic in tone, but anti-Arabian. Its superficial fancies are so ridiculous that at first one wonders if it is just a leg pull or pure spoof. And this guy's just absolutely enraged. He concludes, after ploughing through this tiresome travesty of history, one finds on the dust cover the author's self-assured assertion, this challenging book will be of interest to all those concerned with the study of Islamic history and civilization, etc. The more the pity that it has been so ill-advised as to be conned into. He mentions that it was published by Cambridge Press, and then he says, the more the pity that it has been so ill-advised as to be conned into giving its imprimatur to this pretentious humbug. So that's from Robert Surgeon, and he was pretty upset by this work. And there were others as well. So that's an example of the outrage of an Orientalist dinosaur. We've also seen an example of the outrage of a religious ideologue, Khan. And also some of the criticisms were about sort of vague rhetoric, about the terminology, the style and the terminology are difficult to penetrate, and so on and so forth. And some of the criticisms were just sort of meaningless. So, like, I mean, for example, Mannheimer says the conclusions drawn lack balance. The weights on the scales tip too easily towards the hypercritical side, unquote. I mean, that's fine, but it's not good enough just to give that sort of generic rhetoric. You have to give examples, you know. I mean, it's just, or Van S says, Crone and Cook expect the reader to stumble through cultures and continents with Hegelian 7-league boots, unquote. I mean, again, it's funny, but I mean, it's not, nothing follows from that. Although, in fairness, Van S actually did give a lot of actual examples and criticisms of specific interpretations. So his criticism was actually a good one. But there was a lot of the reviews just had just really vague rhetoric like that. You know, what else? Holmberg says, one could say that Crone and Cook show no charity at all in relation to the Islamic sources, since they are basically wiped aside. You know, well, I mean, there's a reason why they're wiped aside. But whatever. So if we go beyond this kind of vague rhetoric, and if we go beyond the complaints pertaining to style and terminology, and we go beyond the hysterical outrage of some, you know, like Sergeant and Orientalists like him, and, you know, religious Muslim ideologues like Khan, then we're left with about, I think, 5 broad criticisms that have been leveled at Hagerism. So this was the critical reception. These were the core criticisms. So firstly, according to some critics, the early non-Muslim sources are dubious, you know, are unreliable, or even somehow less reliable than the later Muslim sources. And so therefore it's, you know, it's invalid to construct or reconstruct early Islamic history on their basis. Now, of course, this claim has been countered by Hoyland and Shoemaker recently, and, you know, I mean, Shoemaker systematically establishes the reliability and usefulness of the relevant sources. So this, in hindsight, this criticism turned out to be unfounded. The second major criticism was that the revisionist hypotheses, like Hagerism and others, presuppose a widespread conspiracy by ancient Arabs to deliberately and deceptively mutate their religion into Islam and to obscure its true origins, and that this sort of massive, widespread conspiracy is, you know, totally implausible. But this is actually a misrepresentation. So, for example, Shoemaker identifies the plausible pressures, processes, and rationalizations that facilitated the organic transformation of Paleo-Islam without the need for duplicity. Right. So this criticism is actually invalid also. You know, it's not, there's no need to suppose some sort of massive conspiracy. Instead, we can just point to sort of the organic evolution of culture and various sort of dynamic processes and rationalizations that would have sort of prompted the transformation of the religion without any sort of, you know, secret society or fucking Illuminati or something, you know, secretly changing Islam or something. The third major criticism that is often leveled at Hagerism is that the early non-Muslim sources actually conform to the traditional Muslim origins narrative, which I just find insane. You know, I mean, like the Doctor of Jacob mentions Muhammad proclaiming the Messiah, the imminence of the Messiah. Various sources mention Muhammad being alive and being the leader of the Arabs during their invasion of Palestine after 632. Certain sources mention the Jewish presence within Paleo-Islam when they invaded Palestine, right? The Jewish participants and mentioned by Ben Yochai, in fact, appears to be from a Jewish participant within Paleo-Islam. What else? Oh, the Paleo-Muslim conquest of Arabia is described as happening subsequent to the conquest of Syria and Egypt and Iraq by one source. The other sources mention that Palestine was the focus of the early religion. Another source mentions that the direction of the Qibla was, and the location of the Kaaba were in a different, were elsewhere, in somewhere in southern Palestine. You know, and so on and so forth, right? The sources, I mean, I find that so bizarre that people try and make that claim that, hey, the early sources have been reevaluated by Hoyland, and actually it just confirms the picture. Islam is just like it is now. That's insane. It's like they haven't read the sources, Anyway, and not to mention, right, the complete absence of terms such as Muslim, Islam, Khalifat Allah, and so on and so forth in early Arabic epigraphy prior to the 690s, or almost the complete absence of any mention. Well, the complete absence of any book called the Quran known to any contemporaneous observers until the 700s. I mean, it's just kind of ridiculous to say that, Anyway, so in sum, this criticism by some critics of Hagerism that the early non-Muslim sources actually confirm the traditional Muslims' origins narrative is just too ridiculous to think about. The fourth major criticism is that Crone and Cook cherry-picked Muslim tradition where it suited their thesis, which I think is a misreading of what they actually did. I think in reality, what they did was identified the fossilized remnants of Paleo-Muslim traditions from the 7th century, preserved in later Muslim historiography from the 9th century and the 10th century, and so on and so forth. So, for example, Umar's messianic title, or hadith which seemed to indicate that the Hijra is focused on Palestine. Stuff like that. And also, this also debunks the claim that, quote, what sort of people could be so easily deceived by these rapid religious changes and then forget all about them, unquote, right? Like, if early Islam began as so different, then how did people forget about it? And the answer is, well, they didn't. We still have lots of, Paleo-Islamic traditions preserved. Obvious archaisms, like those hadith which portray Muhammad as saying that, the world is going to end during my lifetime, or before someone in my generation dies. These are obviously, Paleo-Islamic traditions that are anachronisms, that are not anachronisms, anomalies vis-a-vis later Muslim orthodoxies. Right. So it's anyway so this criticism number 4 is that they're cherry picked. I don't think that's an accurate assessment of what they did. And the final criticism, which is a retrospective criticism, is that Crone and Cook have backpedaled. As we noted already, yeah, sure, the central thesis has been rejected, but the methodology and a lot of the essential conclusions still stand, and that sort of brings us to the fourth section, which is the subsequent impact, the long-term impact of Hagerism. But before I do that, there's something else I want to do. But first, what are your thoughts? Ozzy, you haven't spoken in a while. What do you reckon?
Right. No problem. Yeah, so I think, let's see if I have any questions. Well, it sounds like a common theme with a lot of these criticisms is one could argue that the critics have actually not done a great job of actually either, one, reading Hagerism for themselves, or not even really doing a deep reading into the early non-Muslim sources. Because especially the criticism to say that the early sources confirm the Islamic tradition, that would probably take someone to make that statement, and not actually read the early sources, like you were saying. So I do find that really troubling, that people are going to make these claims and then not avail themselves to the actual material to see that their statements are totally incorrect.
Yeah, I mean, but what's also quite funny is that what I've sort of tacitly conceded that all the criticism of that the reception of Hagerism, the early reception of Hagerism, was all negative, right? But actually, one can actually invert the ideological, Muslim apologist practice, right? So what Muslim apologists will often do when they deal with Hagerism is where is it? They will lazily cherry pick reviews by the apoplectic surgeon and others for criticism, So they'll cherry pick all the bad, all the angry or highly critical quotes from reviews, and they'll omit praises and concessions in order to sort of construct a distorted image of Cronin Cook as, bigoted, unprofessional villains on the margins of respectable academia, right? CF, that quote I gave before about how Crohn's is a fringe, rubbish bigot. No one takes her seriously. But actually, what one can do is Hadrianism was actually widely praised in many respects by many critics, even though it was also criticized, right? And one can also take all the positive quotes as well, right? So Nimoy said Hadrianism should be read by everyone interested on the topic, right? In the subject. The book is visibly the fruit of much thought and work, as well as of wide reading in the vast literature on the subject. Mannheimer says, the research on Hadrianism is thorough, right? Wansbrough said, the author's erudition is quite extraordinary. Their industry everywhere evident, their prose ebullient. I don't know how to pronounce that word, sorry. Van Ash says, to be fair, it should be said that the authors are extremely well read, and there are almost no inaccuracies in the documentation. Grabber says that Hadrianism is a brilliant, fascinating, original, arrogant, highly debatable book. And he says, the book does have extraordinary merits. And there's a whole bunch of other quotes from him as well. What else? Daniel mentions their undoubted brilliance. Wayne says the book has raised serious and legitimate questions. Harani said that Cronin Cook are asking the right questions. And Donna actually gives the most flattering review, amazingly. Because I had assumed that he was, he seemed like quite a critic of Crone, but and Cook, but he actually gave a really praising review. He says, now 30 years later, we can see that the publication of Hagerism, whatever, was a milestone in the history of Islamic studies. It literally set the agenda for the next generation of work. And he also says, the simple and eminently reasonable methodology promulgated by Cronin Cook had stupefyingly complex implications. He says the quote, the simple and eminently reasonable, unquote, methodology had, quote, stupefyingly complex implications in terms of how one pursued history. And he also says, despite its shortcomings, the basic methodological point of Hadrianism, that historians of Islamic origins need to behave truly as historians and subject their sources to rigorous criticism, was positive, valuable, and long overdue in a field that was so hidebound that it often resisted looking at the real evidence, unquote. Right? And so there are numerous, and there are others that I've skipped over. So there are numerous, highly praising comments that many of the critics gave about Hadrianism, which you wouldn't know if you looked at the cherry picking of, these online apologists and ideologues who only take the angry or the critical quotes and ignore or skip or omit this sort of material, right? So Hadrianism actually had a very mixed review. It wasn't completely condemned at all. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's important that you've pointed out that there were positive reviews of it, and that unlike certain individuals who might be trying to convince us that it was all just a negative reception, I think it's important that you've highlighted the positive reviews, certainly. So I'm just wondering at this point, with we have about 10 minutes left in this particular episode, because unfortunately I will have to actually still stop at 6, but I'm glad we could get an hour of a discussion for you.
Well, would you want me to quickly conclude by explaining what the long-term impact has been?
Yeah, please do. I'd be curious to transition to that, please.
So even though even though the actual thesis of Hagerism about, the provincial transformation process of Paleo-Islam has failed to win general acceptance amongst academic historians, the methodology they pioneered, the prioritization of the earlier sources over the later sources, has now predominated within the field, right? And this Hagerism influence methodology is partially utilized by Donner in his 2010 Mohammedan Believers, fully rehabilitated by Hoyland in his 2015 In God's Path, and I think most spectacularly implemented by Shoemaker in his 2012 The Death of a Prophet. And these recent works also exemplify the resurgence of certain conclusions that were articulated in Hagerism. The interreligious or ecumenical nature of Paleo-Islam, eschatological nature of Paleo-Islam, the lateness of the terms Muslim and Islam as identities for the religion, the rejection of Paleo-Islam as some sort of new or discrete religion, being instead some sort of reformist or eschatological movement within Judeo-Christian tradition, etc. So actually, the methodology and a lot of the key conclusions are now mainstream within the relevant field. And I'll just conclude with this quote from Donner. Hagerism came in 1977 as a very loud wake-up call to the then rather sleepy field of his early Islamic studies, and like most wake-up calls, its arrival was not exactly welcomed. Not only many traditionally minded Muslims, but also much of the Western scholarly establishment that dealt with early Islam, which was also quite traditionally minded, viewed the author's method, and in particular their attempted reconstructions and conclusions, with incomprehension or downright horror. Yet now, 30 years later, we can see that the publication of Hagerism was a milestone in the history of Islamic studies. It literally set the agenda for the next generation of work on early Islam, as it continues to do today, and is responsible for the fact that for the past 2 decades, the study of Islamic origins has been one of the most vibrant and interesting branches of Middle Eastern studies, unquote. So, yeah. In short, Hagerism, despite its shortcomings, despite being outdated, despite many of its sort of conclusions being incorrect, a lot of the key essential points have now become mainstream and accepted, and most importantly, the methodology is now mainstream. And that has been the legacy of Hagerism.
Wow. Well, I think that's great that you read that quote, because certainly it would seem that way. That certainly with my own reading of the books that you've mentioned, Shoemaker and Hoyland and Donner, that is, and even we can toss Tom Holland into the mix as well. Just to see how mainstream the favoring of the early sources. But it almost, when you've been talking about the subject, it's sort of like, I think you alluded to this when we first started, it was like sort of a no-brainer when it comes to anyone who understands archaeology and history, that it makes sense to favor the earlier sources. The earlier sources, the better. And it just mind boggles me that when I hear certain apologists who will utilize people like Bart Ehrman or other individuals who are not overly critical, but sort of more critical historians of the Christian tradition. The methodology of Bart Ehrman is to favor the earliest sources, and certainly he talks about doing that when it comes to the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. So it almost it's amazing to me that it took a while for this sort of what would appear to be a no-brainer methodology to become accepted in the field of Islamic studies.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty extraordinary, but it has now predominated. So Cook win. So yeah,
right.
And look, I think they were wrong in some key respects. So, for example, one notable criticism that I would give of their work is that they seem to assume the traditional Muslim assumption that the Arabian milieu of Muhammad was pagan, and that therefore the Arab conquerors adopted Christian and Samaritan ideas subsequent to their conquest of the Middle East. right? Whereas in actual fact, now what research is suggesting is that Muhammad and the Quran emerged from a Judeo-Christian milieu, rather than the Judeo-Christian milieu being adopted and revised by the Arabs as they entered it. You know what I mean? So it's sort of like that would be a foundational, you know, error or update that needs to be taken into account. But in general, you know, I mean, the methodology of Hagerism is you know, I mean, it just makes sense.
Yeah.
It has come to predominate.
Yeah, well, and that you know, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I really do recommend, and I know you would recommend and you have actually in one of your YouTube
Yes,
videos.
yeah, read it. It's good.
Yes, you recommended Hagerism as well as the books of Hoyland, Holland, Shoemaker, and Donner. So I would second that as well.
If you are lazy, as we all are, and you just want like a process, I'm currently writing an article which summarizes these things, which takes the key quotes from Hagerism, explains them, summarizes what the methodology is, and the arguments with all relevant quotes and citations and where these arguments are articulated, as well as quoting and summarizing all the critical reviews, and then giving examples of how its subsequent impact. So if you're too lazy to read the book, you can, I'll at some point I'll be posting a praesis on my blog.
Awesome. Well, certainly we look forward to reading that. And for those of you who are listening, once Klingshcor has posted his article, I'll put a link to the article on his blog on the more info section of this video, so that if you'd like to go back and listen to Klingshcor's excellent summary of Patricia Crona and Michael Cook's book Hagerism, then are interested in getting a more in-depth understanding of it, but aren't quite ready to dive into the books that we've mentioned during this program, then certainly you can start. The second step could be to read the blog post. But we're definitely looking forward to reading. I know I'm looking forward to reading your post once it's published.
Cool. So does this sort of bring us to a close now?
Yeah, I guess the way I'd like to end, just with the minute we have left, is not to lock you into a future topic, but it's always I just want to thank you again for coming onto the show, and you always bring such a in-depth study into this topic and the various topics about Islam. And I'm just wondering, next time I have you on the show, is there a future topic that the listeners can look forward to in the near future? Of course, this wouldn't be you committing to something 100%, but just curious what you might want to explore.
That's fine. I mean, I enjoy coming on, right? So this is, I'm happy to come on again. Gee, what have I been working on? There's a couple of things I've been working on. So, for example, I've actually been updating material on Aisha and her marriage or consummation with Muhammad at age 9. I've been working through the some 40 hadith that talk about that, or the historical problem of Abu Bakr. Did he exist? Probably, but there's a lot of problems around him there. I've been working on African stereotypes in Arabic thought, looking at the various sort of tropes in Arabic literature, like classical Arabic literature about sub-Saharan Africans. What else have I been working on? I've updated. Oh, there's a couple of things. Yeah, the history of the Quran. Yeah.
So things that aren't controversial at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well. I would say any one of those, I'm sure, would hold a captive audience. And so, how about you and I, as we regularly correspond? We'll figure out one or two of those for next time I have you on the show, because certainly I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of those topics. So we will, in due time, figure out another date, and hopefully we won't have any technical time. But yeah, so I think we'll conclude the show here. But I want to thank you again, Klingshcor, for coming on, and thank you all who are listening.
Thank you for having me on. It's a joy.
Yeah, of course. And thank you all who are listening live. Thank you for my live studio audience here with me. And we will we'll catch you all later, and peace be with you all.